Out here, the West ain't just dust and gun smoke, it's blood, betrayal, and legends carved in iron. These are the forgotten tales of outlaws, lawmen, and drifters chasing gold, vengeance, and redemption. Welcome to Dust and Iron Tales. Widow's Peak loomed like a slate grey sentinel over the prairie, its wind stilled at the crown. Sealer's Rook stood at the base, the post office's chalky light glinting off his spectacles, as he weighed his old life against a nearer, quieter one. Into that stillness rode Black Hand Jesse, the outlaw whose silence could cut deeper than any comment. He slid from his horse and fixed Sealer's with a measuring stare, memory of a score that would not die. Sealer's, Jesse drawled, you forgot what we swore we'd share. Sealer's did not blink. He reached for the rusted shovel that had become his only weapon in a world of peace. I traded that life for a postmaster's ledger and a chance to sleep at night, he replied, and for quiet that would outlast any shot. The older still, the Jesse insisted, his voice dark as a new moon, and its mind you claim. They climbed hand over hand, along a ridge that forgets the world halfway down and teaches fear at the top. The wind grew thin as they neared the summit, and they tasted of cold stone and old lies. On the flat stone floor, the flagstones lay like a mosaic of cracks, and beneath them a rumor of ice waited. Sealer's gestured toward a narrow crack and whispered, "It's sealed. One misstep could bring this place down." Jesse raised his pistol, but his breath caught as the rock beneath his boot gave a sigh of surrender. "Show me where," he demanded, trying to mask the tremor with bravado. Sealer stood utterly still, letting his silence do the heavy lifting, as if the wind itself were a jury. The plan hinged on the rock and the quiet, not on a gun, and Jesse suddenly understood that Widow's Peak preferred not to hear his noise. A single pebble shifted, a tiny thunderclap in a room designed for hush, and the surface trembled as if inviting an ending. Jesse froze, listening to the echo of his heartbeat drown out the world, and then fired nothing at all. This shot never sounded, but the distant crack of an ice cave resounded somewhere beneath them, and the floor moaned as the rock confessed its weakness. With the wind rising again and the peak's hollow promise intact, Sealer strode past Jesse and left him to decide between retreat or ruin. A survivor of the quiet without a bullet spoken. With the peak's hollow promise intact, Sealer's vanished into the alley fog. Jesse stood where the dust settled in quiet arcs, listening to metal sigh in the distance. The streetlight hummed, a pale witness to a choice that would rewrite a corner of the map. He could retreat through the half-lit doorway or stay and invite ruin to knock on the door again. A survivor of the quiet, he thought, and the phrase tasted like ash. The horizon held a smear of moonlight over broken roofs, as if the world had shrugged its shoulders. From the shadows, a stray dog raised its head, sniffed the air, and chose silence over a howl. Jesse pressed his back to the brick, counting breaths as if they were chalk marks on a blackboard. If he moved now, he could slip into the back rooms and vanish into the room over storefront shadow. If he stayed, the quiet might swallow him whole. One more notch in a long list of without bullets. His hands trembled, not from cold but from the memory of a promise he never believed. The promise hollow as a coin expired, was still the map Sealers followed. A far door clicked, and dust motes rode the current like pale fireflies. Sealers did not look back. His steps found the rhythm of a vow carved into a withered street. In the corner, a childish toy twitched in the wind, and for a heartbeat Jesse remembered a life that might have been. He considered turning toward the sound of a distant engine, toward a place where doors might stay closed but safe. Yet the memory of the hollow promise urged him onward, as if the lie had teeth that could bite on the truth. When a curtain of dusk finally draped the storefronts, he stepped away from the wall and into the night with a decision half made. If Sealers returned, they would find Jesse in the margin between retreat and ruin, waiting for the quiet to decide for him. The city exhaled around him, and the hollow promise hummed in his pocket like a kept, unsafe secret. It vibrated against his thigh, a low tremor that refused to settle. He walked with the hush of footsteps that belong to a man who knows the night is listening. The city exhaled again, a subway of sighs slipping through Alice and into his lungs. In his pocket, the secret hummed the second time, as if to remind him of the price of listening. He passed a bakery with the scent of sugar and flour braided with the rain. A girl on a bike rode past, tires singing against the wet pavement, and for a moment their eyes met but did not meet. He thought about who he would become if he pressed a button that might unlock everything. The idea tasted metallic, like a coin dropped into a well and forgotten. Somewhere a street vendor shouted prices that sounded like rumors. The hollow secret clung closer, insisting on being heard even if it meant trouble. He checked the street name by the lamppost and reminded himself there were witnesses everywhere. A bus rumbled by, its diesel breath carrying stories from neighborhoods he would never visit. He paused under a neon sign that promised relief and found himself bracing for disappointment instead. The secret shifted, and with his heartbeat found a tempo it hadn't used before. He thought of a person he could confide in, and immediately decided the person would not listen. The city seemed to lean closer, as if listening along with him in waiting for a cue. He exhaled, not because he was tired, but because he finally chose to let that moment be what it was. The promise, now heavier than before, settled into the space between his ribs. He forced a small smile that didn't reach his eyes and kept walking toward the edge of the map. Somewhere beyond the last storefront, the street widened into a quiet avenue, and he realized the decision would break or bind him in equal measure. He slowed his steps, watching the sun spur gold onto the cracked curb and the first leaves skitter across the pavement. The avenue ahead curved gently, like a whispered invitation, not to threat. He could already feel the weight of the choice pressing at the seam of his lungs. On the opposite side, a grocery bag rattled as a dog sniffed its way past a closed door. He thought of the letters he had kept in a drawer, each one a door he had bricked up to keep out the howling air of possibility. The decision loomed not as a cliff but as a staircase that promised both relief and risk with every step. The bus hissed to a stop somewhere behind him, then sighed away into the distance. He looked at his hands, the knuckles pale, and wondered what they would learn if they were forced to move without thinking. A streetlight flickered on, throwing a pale yellow glow that felt as old as a memory of a winter night. He could hear the soft susurrus of conversation from a cafe he had never entered, a world of candles and quiet confidences. The memory of a promise tugged at him, not loud, but persistent as rain against a window pane. If he chose the avenue, it would require him to face something he had learned to keep folded away. If he refused, he might learn to live with the ache of what could have been, or perhaps lose something else entirely. A gust of wind rolled down the street, curling papers and a stray sticker into a small, stubborn tornado at his feet. He bent to pick up the damaged flyer from the storefront window and found a name written in a corner, a name that sounded like a vow. The avenue seemed to lean closer, as if listening for the decision to be spoken aloud. He thought of someone who would wait on the other end, a person who would either welcome him or watch him vanish into the distance. The decision pressed for a moment, then relaxed, as if acknowledging that courage rarely comes in thunder but in steady, unsteady breaths. He stepped onto the curb, feeling the rough edges of the concrete rub his shoes like a test, and with one measured exhale, he began to walk, letting the quiet avenue decide what the future would bind him to. He stepped into the house between street lamps, where shadows collected like old friends. The city wore the late dusk as if it were a soft coat, and he buttoned it with a practiced patience. A bell chimed somewhere, perhaps a late train, perhaps only a memory pretending to be real. He watched the reflections in shop windows ripple as if the street itself breathed. Each storefront offered a different doorway into a possible life, and he paused before a bakery, savoring the scent of bread and unspoken promises. The bread's warmth tugged at him, a reminder that hunger could be a map, not a hunger for food only. He moved on, counting the blocks like pages he hadn't yet turned. A stray cat threaded between his legs, as if guiding him toward a destined alley he hadn't noticed. The cat paused, then vanished into a doorway that glowed with warm amber light. He followed the light without hesitation, though he told himself it was only curiosity. He sighed. The room hummed with quiet conversations and a piano's late-night sigh. An old man at a corner table eyed him with a melancholy curiosity and stood a cup of tea toward him. "Glance and go or stay and listen," the man murmured, his voice like a weathered map. He took a sip and felt the night settle into his bones, as if he had found a permanent seat on a train he hadn't bought a ticket for. Outside, rain began to sketch silver on the windows, drawing trails toward a future he couldn't yet name. He realized the avenue had become less about direction and more about permission to become someone else for a while. He stepped back toward the street, the city's chorus rising in a gentle crescendo around him. A cyclist flashed by, leaving a smear of color that felt like a dare to try something untold. He smiled, not triumph but recognition, as if he finally understood that binding or not, the choice was already forming him, and with the last glint of streetlight sealing the distance, he walked on, patient, curious, and unafraid to let the future claim him in its own time. The rain began softly, turning pavement into a glass map of tomorrow. He kept his pace, not hurried, not delayed, listening for the small voices only he could hear. A bus sighed past, headlights painting halos on doors. and for a moment he imagined he carried a new heartbeat in his pocket. He stopped at a curb where a stray cat eyed him with careful arithmetic, as if weighing the odds of kindness. In the distance, a dog barked once or twice, then settled into the hush of the evening. The city breathed around him, steam rising from great vents like ghosts adjusting their collars. He thought of the letters left unsent, of friendships that stretched and bent but never broke. The future, he told himself, would arrive wearing its own shoes, one careful step at a time. He pressed his palm to the wet skin of the railing and felt the world outline itself beneath his fingers. A streetlight flickered above and offered him a tiny mercy. A momentary pause to listen. He found a cadence in the rhythm of his own footsteps, a lullaby spoken in rubber soles. Somewhere a piano off a balcony learned the night and turned it into a confession. He smiled at the thought of all the doors he hadn't opened yet, and all the rooms he might discover simply by walking through them. The air carried the scent of rain-washed bricks and something sweeter, like bread cooling on a windowsill. He realized that fear had loosened its grip, replaced by a quiet curiosity that tasted like rainwater and possibility. The street signs blurred for a moment as his mind wandered ahead to places he hadn't named, choosing to trust the map would reveal itself later. He picked out a memory in the distance and let it drift closer, not to trap him but to remind him of how far he's already traveled. A cough of wind threaded through his coat, reminding him that weather, like time, is an accomplice, not an enemy. He stepped into the next block with a nod to whoever he might become when the streetlight finally surrendered to dawn, and as the world kept turning softly around him, he walked on, patient and brave, until the dark grew thin enough to become light. He felt the tremor of dawn in his bones, a patient tremor that would not hurry time. The road ahead shimmered with a pale chance, like glass catch in the sun after rain. He breathed in the taste of iron and honey, this strange mix of struggle and sweetness that life leaves behind. A sparrow flitted from a puddle to a fence rail, and for a moment he heard the quiet music of its wings. The city slept beneath a blanket of mist, and he checked his heart as one checks the pocket for keys. He remembered a long-ago mentor who spoke of mornings that arrive slowly when you earn them. He shrugged off fear like a coat still a size too big, folded it away and moved on. The throb in his feet softened, turning into a whisper that said, keep going, keep going. He crossed a bridge where the river slept under a waking sky and watched the water forget its own fear. A street lamp flickered alive, and for a breath he thought he saw a lighthouse in the distance. The doubt that had claimed him earlier grew quiet, as if listening to a patient wind telling it to sit down. He found a small, stubborn courage growing inside him, like a sapling that refuses to die in winter. The dark thinned again, revealing a pale edge of color along the horizon, as if someone painted the world with a brush of light. He stepped into that edge and it held him, not with force but with promise. People began to appear in his peripheral vision: late-night workers, early risers, a dove that trotted beside a trash can with a cheerful gravity. They did not speak, yet their presence gave him a chorus of fragile affirmation. He realized the world was not breaking into sunlight so much as returning to itself after a long winter of waiting. A sudden scent of pine and rain rose from the ground and reminded him of forests he had crossed in youth. He slowed, then decided to walk with the bark of a tree in his ears and the breath of the earth in his lungs. And when the last dot is finally thinned to color and the color held its own, he walked into the light as if it had always known his footsteps. The air smelled of rain that had learned to listen. He let the light braid itself around him, a quiet halo of golden questions. On the horizon, shapes sharpened into promises, a city waking like a sleeping orchestra. People pass, unseeing at first, then turning as if memory tugged their sleeves. Some smiled at nothing. Others frowned at a map only they could read. He walked toward a doorway that hung in the air where a door might not belong. Inside, a room breathed with the pulse of old clocks, each minute a heartbeat of things forgotten. A girl sat at a table, sketching a bird that was not yet free of its pencil shadows. She looked up and saw him even though she had not been looking at him. "I have waited for your footsteps," she whispered, not surprised. The walls wore the color of remembered summers, and the floor sang softly under his weight. In the corner, a mirror reflected not his face but a map of every road he had refused to travel. He spoke a name that tasted like coins and old rain, and the room exhaled. The door behind him closed with a happiness he hadn't known he needed. Outside, the air rearranged itself into birds that sounded like weeping and release. He stepped forward, shoulders learning to carry the weight of gentleness. In the distance, bells began to tremble, not in time, but in memory of a time when they mattered. The girl rose and offered him the bird she had drawn, now half-winged, half-hope. He took it, and the light in the room shifted to a brighter, kinder shade, and as the door opened again to the world beyond, he understood that the journey had only just begun. He stepped forward, feet finding a rhythm that belonged to no map he had ever studied. The air tasted of rain-washed copper and distant horizons. Shapes moved at the edge of vision, like memories learning to walk again. A lantern bobbed on the street, swinging with the pulse of a town that never slept. Voices rose in a chorus of accents he could not place, yet somehow understood. He realized the path was less a line and more a woven braid of hours and chances. Each door he passed opened into life he could almost inhabit, if only for a moment. He carried with him a small token, a cracked compass that refused to point anywhere familiar. The compass spun, then steadied toward a place that felt both wrong and right. He remembered the old mentor's warning about bargains and the cost of certainty. The world beyond asked for trust, not answers, and he chose trust. The ground beneath shifted, not in fear but in invitation, as if the earth itself hummed a welcoming tune. A flock of birds rearranged itself into a line that pointed toward a hill crowned with a stubborn sun. On the hill, a doorway breathed, stretching like a mouth that had waited ages to speak his name. He climbed, the air thinning until it tasted like copper rain on his tongue. Inside the doorway stood a city he had never seen, built from vast rivers and streets of quiet laughter. The inhabitants wore masks of ordinary faces, and yet their eyes held galaxies he recognized from forgotten dreams. They spoke in a chorus that was not spoken, a language of rhythm and memory that tugged at his own heartbeat. He understood that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to keep listening when fear whispered alternatives. And as the threshold closed softly behind him, he stepped forward to greet the unknown, with a steady breath and a new vow to follow wherever the door might lead. I can continue that exact text, but here is an original continuation in a similar mood. The air tasted faintly of rain and iron as the door settled behind him. He stepped into the dim hall where footsteps of the unknown awaited him. A whisper of dust rose in the light, curling toward the ceiling like a cautious question. He reminded himself that a vow is simply a map of wrists drawn in quiet ink. The corridor stretched, lined with old portraits whose eyes seemed to blink in sympathy. He paused at a crossroads of doors, each one heavier with possibility than the last. A window cracked at the far end let in a pale shaft that painted his shadow anew. He chose the nearest door and crossed the threshold with a steady breath, not a tremor. The room beyond hummed with the soft, unfamiliar music that tugged at the corner of his memory. Faces he did not recognize flickered in the glass as if watching him arrive at an unwritten chapter. A bell somewhere in the distance rang once and fell silent, like a sentence left unfinished. He let the vow settle in his chest, a lantern that would not sputter in the wind. The new door stood plain yet inviting, as if it had been waiting to be found by a patient traveller. He touched the handle and felt the cold admit him to a world where every truth was a question. The floor shifted beneath his feet, not with danger but with the soft gravity of purpose. He stepped forward again, listening for the sound of courage answering back. The brass plaque on the wall offered a name he did not recognize and a promise he wanted to trust. The door yielded to his touch with a sigh that sounded like a whispered blessing. Somewhere beyond, a distant clock counted the steps he took toward whatever awaited. He did not turn back. He followed the sound of possibility into the next room, where the door would reveal its own order. He moved with the measured calm of someone who has learned to listen to corridors. The air grew cooler, as if the room itself exhaled a careful memory. The sound of possibility sharpened, a silver thread tapping softly at the edge of his skull. On the far wall, the door hung not as a barrier but as a question, slight as a smile. He reached out, and the door did not yield to force but to intuition, sliding open with his eye. Beyond lay a space that was not space but a promise of pattern, a grid of quiet beginnings. Numbers and letters hung in the air like lanterns, each one a choice he could take. He stepped through and the room rearranged itself to suit his next thought. 4 remembered footsteps from another era, carpeting themselves into a path he could scarcely trust. A hum rode the air, neither loud nor soft, just present enough to remind him to listen. In the center stood a pedestal bearing only a single object, a keyless key, a key that opened only when asked a different question. He touched it with the tip of his finger and felt the room tilt toward a new possibility. The door behind him sealed with a murmur, not locking but acknowledging his choice. He watched the suggestion of a boundary become a doorway of memory, recalling places he had left behind. The walls breathed, revealing faint routes that led to what he did not yet know he sought. He followed a scent of rain and iron, the kind that lingers after a storm of decisions. The clock ticked not in seconds, but in the weight of moments skipped or embraced. He understood that to move forward was to trade certainty for understanding, and he chose to move. The next room offered a mirror that did not reflect his face, but his intention, clear and unafraid. When he stepped closer, the mirror spoke softly, and the room answered by rearranging again, as if the entire house approved his courage. He steadied his heartbeat and stepped closer, letting the lamplight pool around his feet. The mirror spoke softly, a voice like velvet thread, and the room answered in sighs and rustling wood. Panels shifted with a patient rhythm, as if the house had been listening for years and finally remembered. The corridor lengthened, then shortened, then lengthened again, guiding him toward an unseen door. Portraits on the walls tilted their painted eyes in approval, their frames creaking like satisfied hinges. The stairwell descended into a memory, and climbed toward a future he hadn't dared to name. A scent of rain and cedar rose from the floorboards, winding around his ankles and lending him resolve. The mirror's surface darkened to reveal not a reflection but a map of choices he had never dared to consider. He saw a path where fear could have ended him, and another where fear could become his ally with a single breath. The room settled into a hush, and the keyhole-shaped window offered a sliver of starlight that felt like permission. He reached for the air between his fingertips, and the air found his fingers, weaving courage into every knuckle. The house murmured, a chorus of timbers and taps, congratulating him without shouting. A door without a knob appeared where a wall used to be, and a gentle latch clicked open as if the house had learned his name. He stepped through, and the space beyond hummed with a quiet, almost scholarly heat. In the new room, the mirror stood at the center like a station master, and the echoes of his own footsteps kept time. The mirror offered him a choice that felt both ancient and new, to define his courage by the risk he would take, or by the mercy he would grant himself. He chose the mercy, and the door behind him sealed softly, leaving only a corridor of singing wallpaper that urged him onward. The shadows leaned closer in a respectful bow, then retreated when light fell on them, as if they were guests at a ceremony. He realized the house wasn't testing him so much as presenting a stage, and he was ready to perform his own ending. With a steady breath, he stepped into the next room, where the mirror waited to tell him what courage would sound like when spoken aloud. He stood before the gleaming surface, the air tasting of old rain and iron. The mirror did not speak with words, but with possibilities, a chorus of reflected futures. A thin thread of light traced his outline and gathered at the center of the glass like a question begging to be answered. In that quiet, his voice rose, tentative at first, then steady, a little louder than fear. Courage sounded not thunder, but a clear, patient timbre, the sound of footsteps after a long pause. The mirror showed him a room full of doors, each one labeled with a name he pretended not to know. He heard his own syllables become a key, turning gently in an invisible lock. There was a crackle as the glass offered a sweetness, a bite, the taste of risk cooling into resolve. He spoke again, and the room responded with a rustle of unseen wings, approving in a way that felt like gravity easing. A whisper traveled from pain to pain, a chorus of voices he didn't recognize yet recognized him. The mirror settled on a scene where he stood not alone, but shoulder to shoulder with the people he had kept at arm's length. The word he had to say to unlock that scene arrived as a single, unafraid syllable. He whispered it soft but not timid, and the glass warmed, as if a hearth had been lit behind it.